On the 16th day of the month of Tishri in the year 539 BC, a date we can fix with unusual precision because the Babylonian priestly scribes who recorded it were, whatever else they were, meticulous keepers of time. The most powerful city on the face of the earth changed hands without what appears to have been a serious fight. Babylon, the seat of an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, the city of Nebuchadnezzar's legendary walls and Marduk's shimmering temples, the cultural capital of a civilization stretching back millennia into the Mesopotamian clay, fell to the Persian army of Cyrus the Great in circumstances so anticlimactic that ancient sources cannot agree on whether there was even a battle. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly a century later with the confident authority of a man who may or may not have visited the city, tells a story of engineering daring, the Persians diverting the Euphrates River, which flowed directly through the center of the city, and wading in through the lowered riverbed while the oblivious Babylonians danced and drank at a festival, not realizing their city had been taken until the soldiers were already in the streets. The Babylonian Chronicles, clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform by priestly record keepers with their own considerable biases and strategic silences, suggest something closer to a negotiated capitulation, a city that opened its gates because the people inside no longer believed in the regime sitting on the throne. Cyrus's own propaganda, the famous Cyrus cylinder, while a barrel-shaped clay document inscribed with a self-congratulatory account in Akkadian, the prestige language of Mesopotamian diplomacy, tells yet another story entirely, that the Babylonian god Marduk himself had grown angry with the Babylonian king, had searched the world for a righteous replacement, and had chosen Cyrus, a Persian, to liberate the city from a ruler who had offended the divine order. 3 sources, 3 stories, 3 agendas, and behind them all, the same irreducible fact. A city that should have been impregnable fell so quickly that the event has puzzled historians for 25 centuries. The fall of Babylon is one of those moments in history where the speed of the collapse is itself the primary thing requiring explanation, because the physical defenses of the city were not breached in any dramatic sense. The army of the empire was not annihilated in some prior decisive engagement, and the population did not revolt in any conventional meaning of the word. Something else happened, something structural, something slower, something that had been accumulating for years in the widening gap between what the Babylonian state projected and what it actually was. The walls held. Everything behind them had already crumbled. To understand how Babylon fell, you have to understand what Babylon was, and more specifically, what the Neo-Babylonian Empire was, because the city itself and the empire that bore its name were not the same thing, and the relationship between them, the tension between the ancient city and the surprisingly young empire, explains a great deal about the vulnerability that Cyrus would eventually exploit. Drus, Babylon. The city was ancient beyond reckoning by the standards of the 6th century BC. It had been a significant urban center since at least the early 2nd millennium, the capital of Hammurabi's empire around 1792 BC, a city that had been conquered and reconquered, sacked and rebuilt, subordinated and resurgent across more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian history. Its name carried a weight of accumulated prestige that no other city in the ancient Near East could match. Not Nineveh, not Thebes, not even the Egyptian cities that could claim comparable antiquity. Babylon was not just a place, it was an idea, a symbol of civilizational achievement, a word that connoted power and sophistication and the deep wisdom of an inconceivably old culture. But the empire that bore its name in 539, the political entity that Cyrus conquered, was strikingly, almost embarrassingly young. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, sometimes called the Chaldean Empire, after the southern Mesopotamian tribal group from which its founding dynasty emerged, had existed for barely 70 years. It was essentially the creation of 2 men, Nabopolassar, who had revolted against the Assyrian Empire and, in alliance with the Medes, destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC, establishing Babylonian independence for the first time in centuries, and his son Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 BC, and who transformed his father's regional kingdom into a genuine empire that dominated the ancient Near East. Nebuchadnezzar is the figure without whom the rest of this story makes no sense, because he was both the empire's greatest asset and, in a way that only becomes clear in retrospect, the source of its fatal structural weakness. He was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most capable rulers of the ancient world, a military commander who defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in 605, who conquered or subjugated Syria, Phoenicia, and parts of Arabia, who besieged and captured Jerusalem twice, destroying the Temple of Solomon in 586 BC, and deporting the Jewish elite to Babylon in the event remembered in Jewish tradition as the Babylonian captivity, an event that would reshape Judaism, and through Judaism, the entire trajectory of Western religious thought. He was simultaneously a builder of extraordinary ambition and aesthetic vision. The Babylon he constructed was, by the accounts of everyone who saw it, thus one of the most spectacular cities ever built. The Ishtar Gate, with its glazed blue bricks adorned with golden bulls and dragons, opened onto the processional way, a boulevard designed not merely for traffic, but for the annual Akitu festival procession that was the religious and political centerpiece of Babylonian life. The vast temple complex of Esagila, dedicated to Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, was the spiritual heart of the empire. The ziggurat of Etemenanki, the probable inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, rose in stepped tiers toward the sky. And there were possibly the Hanging Gardens, though whether these existed in Babylon at all, or were a later literary invention, or perhaps belonged to Nineveh and were attributed to the wrong city by Greek writers working from second-hand sources, remains one of the great unresolved puzzles of ancient history. What matters for the political story is that Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a project, a deliberate, self-conscious construction of imperial legitimacy through monumental architecture, religious patronage, and military dominance, and like all such projects, it was far more dependent on the continuing competence and vision of its creator than anyone wanted to acknowledge while the creator was still alive and still building. The crack that would eventually bring the whole edifice down appeared the moment Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC. After 43 years on the throne, a reign long enough that an entire generation had grown up knowing no other ruler, long enough that the empire and the man had become psychologically fused in the minds of the elite and the populace alike. The great king died and left behind an empire with no stable mechanism for transferring power. This was not unusual in the ancient Near East. Stable succession was the exception, rather than the rule in most ancient monarchies. But the Neo-Babylonian Empire was unusually vulnerable to succession crises because it was unusually dependent on the personal quality of the king. It lacked the deep bureaucratic institutions, the entrenched provincial administration, in the self-perpetuating military administrative class that had given the Assyrian Empire, the predecessor Babylon had helped destroy, its remarkable institutional resilience across centuries of occasionally mediocre rulers. Babylon had Nebuchadnezzar's personality. When that personality was removed, what remained was less an institution than a court, a collection of factions whose relationships to each other had been managed by the king's authority, and who now had no agreed-upon framework for determining who would manage them next. What followed was a political crisis that reads like a compressed Shakespearean tragedy. Nebuchadnezzar's son, Amel-Marduk, took the throne, ruled for approximately 2 years, during which, if the hostile later sources can be believed, he released the captive Judean king Jehoiakim from prison, either a gesture that may have been merciful or may have been an attempt to cultivate a client relationship with the Jewish exile community, and was then murdered in a coup led by his brother-in-law Neriglissar. Neriglissar was a military man, a general who had married into the royal family and who may have participated in the siege of Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar. He was competent, experienced, and ruthless enough to take the throne by force. He ruled for roughly 4 years, conducting at least one significant military campaign in Cilicia against a local power that was threatening Babylonian interests in the region, before dying of natural causes in 556 BC. His death left the throne to his son Labashi-Marduk, who was by all accounts very young, perhaps a teenager, perhaps younger, and who was himself murdered within months, and possibly within weeks, in yet another palace conspiracy orchestrated by members of the court elite who had decided that a child could not hold the empire together. 3 kings in 6 years, 2 of them assassinated. The dynasty of Nebuchadnezzar extinguished in blood. This was not merely a succession crisis. It was a revelation that the empire's political foundations were far shallower than its monumental architecture suggested, that the magnificent walls and gates and temples were, in a sense, a shell, gorgeous, imposing, and structurally unsupported by the political institutions that would have made them meaningful as anything more than decoration. Nebuchadnezzar had built an empire. He had not built a system capable of surviving his absence. The man who emerged from this chaos, the figure who would be sitting on the throne, or more precisely, not sitting on the throne, when Cyrus arrived, was Nabonidus, and he is one of the strangest, most contested, and most consequential figures in ancient Near Eastern history. Nabonidus was not a member of the royal family. His origins are partially obscure, though he appears to have been from Haran in northern Mesopotamia, a city with its own ancient pedigree located in what is now southeastern Turkey, and he seems to have served in senior administrative or military positions under the previous kings. He was elevated to the throne by a faction of court officials and military men in the aftermath of Labashi-Marduk's murder, possibly because he was seen as a compromise candidate, an experienced elder statesman who could stabilize the situation. Or possibly because he was more politically capable than his sponsors realized and outmaneuvered them once he had the crown. His mother, Adad Gupi, was a figure of considerable interest in her own right, a priestess of the moon god Sin at the temple in Haran, who reportedly lived to an extraordinary age and who left behind an autobiographical inscription that provides rare insight into the religious devotion and political connections of a woman in the upper reaches of Babylonian society. Adad Gupi's devotion to Sin was intense, personal, and, as it turned out, hereditary, because Nabonidus's relationship with the moon god of Haran and his willingness to promote that god at the expense of Babylon's patron deity Marduk would become the central political fact of his reign, the wound through which the lifeblood of the empire would drain away. The surviving sources on Nabonidus are, almost without exception, deeply hostile. The verse account of Nabonidus, a poetic text that reads like a political attack pamphlet, portrays him as a madman who confused dreams with reality, who elevated an illegitimate deity, who oppressed the people, who neglected the temples, who disrupted the proper order of worship. The Cyrus Cylinder, written from the Persian perspective but echoing the same themes, describes a king who imposed upon them an improper ritual and tormented the inhabitants with unrelenting yoke. These are not neutral documents. They were written by, or for the benefit of, the very people who benefited from Nabonidus's fall, the Marduk priesthood whose institutional power he had threatened, and the Persian conqueror, who needed a narrative of liberation to legitimize his seizure of the world's greatest city. The real Nabonidus was almost certainly more complex than the caricature. He was educated, literate, intellectually curious, a collector and restorer of ancient inscriptions, who displayed what some scholars have described as an almost antiquarian interest in the deep past of Mesopotamian civilization. But the caricature mattered more than the reality, because the caricature was politically operative. It shaped how the Babylonian elite understood their king, how they talked about him in the temples and the corridors of the palace, and ultimately how they responded when an alternative presented itself. What Nabonidus did, and what made him so dangerous to the political order he ostensibly led, was this. He elevated the cult of Sin, the moon god, made his mother's deity, the patron god of Haran, to a position of prominence that directly and unmistakably challenged the supremacy of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon and the theological foundation of Babylonian kingship itself. To understand why this mattered, why it was not merely a religious eccentricity but an act of political self-destruction, you have to understand the role Marduk played in the Babylonian political system. Because Marduk was not merely a god whom the Babylonians happened to worship. Marduk was the organizing principle of the Babylonian state. The great creation epic, the Enuma Elish, recited annually during the Akitu festival, told the story of how Marduk had defeated the forces of primordial chaos, created the world from the body of the slain chaos dragon Tiamat, and established order in the cosmos. The Babylonian king ruled as Marduk's chosen representative on earth, and his legitimacy was not inherited, not earned by conquest, but ritually conferred by the god through the annual Akitu ceremony. During the Akitu, which lasted 11 days at the Babylonian New Year, the king underwent a ritual humiliation, stripped of his regalia, slapped across the face by the high priest of Marduk, forced to kneel and declare that he had not sinned against the god or neglected the people, before being reinvested with his crown and his authority. This was not theater, or rather, it was theater in the deepest sense. It was the performance through which political reality was constituted. The king who had not undergone the Akitu was, in a real and consequential sense, not fully the king. His authority was in suspension. The cosmic order was in abeyance. The rains might not come, the harvests might fail, the gods might turn their faces away. For the Babylonian priesthood and the Babylonian populace, these were not metaphors. They were descriptions of how the universe actually worked, and Nabonidus disrupted it. He elevated sin. He appears to have attempted to subordinate Marduk to sin in the theological hierarchy, or at minimum, to establish sin as an equal or superior deity, a move that struck at the very foundation of Babylonian cosmic and political order. Some scholars have seen in Nabonidus's religious program a kind of proto-monotheistic impulse, an attempt to identify sin as a supreme deity encompassing or transcending the traditional pantheon, though this reading is speculative and contested. What is not contested is the political effect. The Marduk priesthood was horrified, the religious establishment was alienated, and the theological ground on which Babylonian kingship stood was, in the eyes of those who maintained it, being deliberately undermined by the very person it was supposed to support. And then Nabonidus did something that transformed alienation into crisis. He left. Around 553 BC, the exact date is uncertain, Nabonidus departed Babylon and took up residence in the oasis city of Tama, deep in the Arabian desert in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia, roughly 700 miles to the southwest. He stayed there for approximately 10 years. 10 years. The king of the most powerful empire in the known world simply abandoned his capital and relocated to a remote desert trading post for a decade. No ancient source explains this decision adequately, and modern scholars have generated a small industry of hypotheses. Some have argued that Tama sat on important trade routes, the caravan routes carrying frankincense, myrrh, and other luxury goods from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean, and that Nabonidus was attempting to control this commerce, redirecting trade flows to benefit Babylon, while simultaneously establishing a new power base outside the reach of the hostile Marduk priesthood. This reading has the virtue of making Nabonidus look rational rather than deranged, and there is some archaeological evidence, inscriptions, building remains, suggesting that he did conduct significant construction and administrative activity at Tama. Others have suggested a primarily religious motivation. Haran, the original center of sin worship that Nabonidus wished to restore, had been destroyed or damaged during the fall of the Assyrian Empire, and may have been under Median and then Persian control, making it inaccessible. Tama, dyed with its own traditions of lunar worship, may have served as a substitute, a new center for the religious program that Nabonidus could not pursue in hostile Babylon or inaccessible Haran. Still others have pointed to internal political dynamics. Perhaps Nabonidus left because his position in Babylon had become untenable. because the Marduk priesthood and the military establishment had made the capital so hostile that retreat was safer than confrontation, because staying would have meant either capitulating to the religious establishment or fighting it openly. And Nabonidus chose a third option, withdrawal. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered at Qumran in the mid-20th century, include a fragmentary Aramaic text known as the Prayer of Nabonidus that adds another layer of intrigue. The text describes a king of Babylon, named, unusually for this type of literature, by his actual name, who was afflicted with a disfiguring disease while living in Tema and was healed by a Jewish exile who told him to give glory to the Most High God. The text is fragmentary, and its relationship to historical events is uncertain, but it suggests that memories of Nabonidus's Arabian sojourn survived in Jewish exile communities and were eventually woven into religious narratives, and it may even be a precursor to the book of Daniel's story of Nebuchadnezzar's madness, Japur, in which the Babylonian king is driven from human society and lives like a beast until he acknowledges the God of Israel. The Daniel story attributes the madness to Nebuchadnezzar, the more famous king, but some scholars believe the original tradition was about Nabonidus and was transferred to Nebuchadnezzar as the more recognizable figure. If so, the transformation is itself telling. It suggests that Nabonidus's behavior was strange enough to generate legends of divine punishment, but that he was obscure enough to be written out of his own story. What is certain, and what mattered far more than Nabonidus's motivations, was the political consequence of his absence. During the 10 years the king spent in Tama, the Akitu festival could not be properly celebrated. The king was not present to perform his role, to be humbled, to confess, no, to be reinvested, to lead the procession, to renew the compact between the divine and the political orders. The Babylonian chronicles record this absence with a formulaic notation that appears year after year. The king did not come to Babylon for the ceremonies of the month of Nisanu. The image of Nabu did not come to Babylon. The image of Bel did not go out. The Akitu festival did not take place. Year after year, the same notation, the same absence, the same suspension of the cosmic order. For the Marduk priesthood, and for the broader Babylonian religious and political establishment, this was not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It was an existential crisis, a rolling decade-long emergency in which the fundamental legitimacy of the state was in abeyance. The relationship between heaven and earth was ruptured, and no one was authorized to repair it. Nabonidus left the governance of Babylon in the hands of his son, Belshazzar, the same Belshazzar who appears in the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible, hosting the famous feast, where a disembodied hand writes mysterious words on the palace wall while the Persians close in, a scene that is almost certainly legendary in its specific details, but that preserves a genuine historical memory. Belshazzar was the man in charge when the end came. The historical Belshazzar was, by the available cuneiform evidence, a competent enough administrator. He managed the day-to-day affairs of the empire, commanded the military forces in and around Babylon, oversaw the collection of revenue, and maintained the functioning of the state apparatus. But he was not the king. As he bore the title Crown Prince, not King of Babylon, and the distinction was not merely semantic. He could not perform the Akitu. He could not embody the relationship between Marduk and the Babylonian state. He could not be stripped and slapped and reinvested, because he had never been invested in the first place. He was, in the most profound sense available to Babylonian political theology, a placeholder, a regent who could manage the machinery, but who could not renew the cosmic compact that made the machinery meaningful. And so, for roughly a decade, the Neo-Babylonian Empire operated under a kind of theological suspension, functioning day-to-day, collecting taxes, maintaining armies, adjudicating disputes, but hollowed out at the level of meaning, its fundamental claim to divine sanction unrenewed, and its priesthood increasingly alienated, its political class increasingly uncertain about the nature and source of the authority they served, and its subject populations increasingly aware that something was deeply wrong at the center. Here I want to pause and introduce a framework for understanding the fall of Babylon. Because the standard narrative, Cyrus was strong, Babylon was weak, the walls were bypassed or the gates were opened, the city fell, misses the most important dynamics at work and reduces one of the most instructive political collapses in human history to a military anecdote. The framework is this. Babylon did not fall primarily because of Persian military superiority, although Persian military capability was real and formidable. Babylon fell because the regime of Nabonidus had severed the relationship between political power and religious legitimacy that was the structural foundation of Babylonian kingship, and in doing so had created a vacuum of meaning that Cyrus, with extraordinary political intelligence, was able to fill. The fall of Babylon was not primarily a military event. It was a legitimacy collapse, a moment when a critical mass of the people inside the walls, including many of the most powerful people inside the walls, concluded that the man who claimed to be their king had forfeited his right to that claim, and that the man outside the gates was, paradoxically, a more credible custodian of Babylonian civilization than the Babylonian king himself. This is not to say that military force was irrelevant. Armies fought, people died, the Battle of Opis was real. But the military dimension was, in a sense, the least important part of the story. Now, what determined the outcome was not the size of the armies or the height of the walls, but the answer to a question that every person in a position of power in Babylon had to answer for themselves. Is this regime worth defending? And enough of them, the priests, the generals, the provincial governors, the merchant elite, answered no. Cyrus did not merely conquer Babylon. He was invited in, not unanimously, not without any resistance at all, but by a critical mass of the establishment that had decided Nabonidus was a greater threat to the Babylonian order than a foreign king who promised to restore it. This is not a simple story of conquest. It is a story about what happens when a ruler loses the narrative, when the story a civilization tells about itself and the actions of its leader diverge so completely that the civilization begins to look for a new protagonist, even if that protagonist speaks a different language and worships different gods. The Persian dimension of this story requires its own extended telling, because Cyrus did not simply stumble upon an opportunity. He built the instrument of Babylon's conquest over approximately 2 decades of sustained empire building, and the method by which he built it, the political style, the strategic philosophy, the approach to defeated enemies, tells you everything about why his approach to Babylon was so devastatingly effective. Cyrus II of Persia, later called Cyrus the Great, a title that his subsequent career amply justified and that the man himself would not have objected to, came to power as king of Anshan, a relatively modest Persian kingdom in the highlands of southwestern Iran, in what is now the province of Fars. At the time of his accession, around 559 BC, Anshan was a vassal state of the Median Empire, the Medes being an Iranian people closely related to the Persians who had established dominance over the Iranian plateau in the aftermath of the Assyrian Empire's collapse, and who had been, along with Nabopolassar's Babylonians, the co-destroyers of Nineveh in 612 BC. The Median king Astyages, who may or may not have been Cyrus's maternal grandfather. The sources are contradictory, and the genealogical claim may have been a later fabrication designed to legitimize the succession, had every reason to believe that Persian vassalage would continue indefinitely. He was wrong, and the speed with which he was proven wrong is itself remarkable. Around 550 BC, Cyrus revolted. The exact sequence of events is disputed. Herodotus tells an elaborate story involving dreams, prophecies, and a baby exposed in the wilderness, most of which belongs to the realm of legend, but the political dynamics are clear enough. Cyrus rallied the Persian tribes, challenged Median authority, and in one of those pivotal moments that hinges on the behavior of individuals in positions of trust, a significant portion of the Median army defected to Cyrus rather than fight him. The Median general Harpagus, who who according to Herodotus had a deep personal grievance against Astyages. The king had allegedly killed Harpagus' son and served the boy's flesh to his unknowing father at a banquet, is a story that is probably legendary, but that captures a real dynamic of court politics fueled by personal vendetta, switched sides, and brought a critical mass of the Median military with him. Astyages was captured, the Median capital of Ecbatana fell, and Cyrus found himself, almost overnight, ruler of an empire stretching across the entire Iranian plateau. The defection of the Median army is more than a colorful anecdote. It established a pattern that Cyrus would repeat, refine, and ultimately perfect throughout his career. Rather than destroying existing power structures, he absorbed them. The Medes were not subjugated, not humiliated, not reduced to a conquered population. They were incorporated as partners, junior partners to be sure, but partners nonetheless. Median nobles retained their positions at court. Non-Median military units served alongside Persian ones. Median customs and administrative practices were respected. The resulting political entity was, in a genuinely meaningful sense, a Medo-Persian partnership, not a Persian empire built on Median ruins. This was not generosity for its own sake, though Cyrus may have possessed a genuine temperamental aversion to unnecessary cruelty that distinguished him from most of his contemporaries. It was a strategy, a recognition, perhaps intuitive, perhaps calculated, that empires built on humiliation generate resistance, while empires built on co-optation generate stability. After absorbing Media, Cyrus turned west. Croesus, the king of Lydia, the fabulously wealthy ruler of western Anatolia whose name survives in the English phrase rich as Croesus, and who had in Herodotus's immortal telling been warned by the Athenian sage Solon that no man should be called happy until he was dead, made the catastrophic decision to challenge Persian expansion. According to Herodotus, Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi and was told that if he attacked the Persians, a great empire would be destroyed. He interpreted this as a promise of victory, crossed the Halys River, and discovered too late that the empire the oracle had in mind was his own. Lydia fell around 547 BC, and with it came the Greek cities of the Ionian coast, Miletus, Ephesus, and others, adding Anatolia and its resources to the Persian domain. Cyrus then turned east, campaigning in Central Asia against nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples, the Bactrians, the Sogdians, various steppe peoples, whose exact identities the sources blur into generality, extending Persian authority to the borders of what is now Afghanistan and possibly beyond. By the time he turned his attention to Babylon in the early 540s, he controlled an empire that dwarfed anything the ancient Near East had previously seen. A vast arc of territory stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Hindu Kush, encircling the Neo-Babylonian Empire on three sides, with Babylon sitting like a jewel in a closing fist. But Cyrus did not simply attack. The military buildup was real. He assembled a large army and positioned it to threaten Babylon's northern and eastern approaches. But the political and ideological preparation was far more subtle and ultimately far more decisive than the military dimension. Cyrus cultivated relationships with disaffected elements within the Babylonian establishment. The exact mechanisms of this cultivation are largely lost to us. We do not have the letters, the secret envoys, the private promises, the back-channel communications that must have passed between Persian agents and sympathetic Babylonian priests, generals, and officials in the years before the invasion. But the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. When Cyrus's army finally moved against Babylon, the degree of internal cooperation it encountered, the gates that opened, the garrisons that stood aside, the cities that surrendered without resistance, cannot be explained by military factors alone. Someone had been talking to someone. The Marduk priesthood, which had the most to gain from Nabonidus's removal and the most to lose from his continued religious program, is the most likely conduit, though they were almost certainly not the only one. The merchant class, dependent on trade routes that Persian control of the surrounding territories was disrupting, had economic incentives to seek accommodation. Military commanders, watching the Persian juggernaut consume one kingdom after another, Media, Lydia, the Central Asian principalities, may have made their own calculations about which side of history they preferred to stand on. And then there was the ideological preparation, the narrative Cyrus constructed to frame the conquest. And this was the masterpiece, the component that elevated a military campaign into something closer to a political revolution. The narrative went like this. Nabonidus was not a legitimate king. He had offended Marduk by elevating sin, by neglecting the Akitu festival, by abandoning Babylon, by oppressing the people with improper rituals and excessive demands. Marduk, in his righteous anger, had surveyed all the lands and all the rulers of the earth, searching for a king worthy of restoring proper worship, and had chosen Cyrus, not a Babylonian, not a worshipper of Marduk, a Persian, a man from the mountains of Iran who had never set foot in Esagila or walked the processional way. But Marduk had chosen him because Marduk cared about justice, about proper worship, about the well-being of the Babylonian people, and Nabonidus had betrayed all three. Cyrus was therefore not a foreign conqueror. He was Marduk's instrument. His conquest was not an invasion, but a liberation. His entry into Babylon would not be a humiliation of the city, but its salvation. The audacity of this narrative is breathtaking. A Persian king from a culture that worshipped Ahura Mazda, that followed Zoroastrian or Proto-Zoroastrian religious traditions, that had no historical connection to the Marduk cult or the Babylonian religious establishment, was presenting himself as the champion of a Babylonian deity, speaking in Babylonian theological language, using Babylonian literary forms, claiming a mandate from a god he had no personal devotion to. Whether Cyrus believed any of this is unknowable and, strategically, irrelevant. What matters, the only thing that matters, is that a critical mass of Babylonians believed it, or were willing to act as if they did, because the alternative, defending a king who had abandoned them, insulted their god, disrupted the cosmic order, and left the Akitu festival uncelebrated for a decade, was worse than accepting a foreign ruler who promised to fix everything. The Cyrus cylinder, which is our primary record of this narrative, is often described as ancient propaganda, and it is, but describing it as propaganda should not obscure how effective it was and how precisely it was calibrated to the specific anxieties and grievances of its Babylonian audience. Cyrus, or rather the scribes and advisors who composed the cylinder's text, or men who clearly had an intimate knowledge of Babylonian literary conventions and theological concerns, did not merely make promises. They constructed an entire theological argument for why the fall of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty was not a catastrophe, but a correction, not the end of Babylonian civilization, but its renewal. They turned a conquest into a restoration narrative, and in doing so, they disarmed resistance more effectively than any army could have. The actual military campaign, when it came, was swift and efficient, but not entirely bloodless. Nabonidus had returned to Babylon from Tama by the time the Persian invasion began. The sources are unclear on exactly when he came back, but he appears to have returned sometime in the early 540s, perhaps recognizing belatedly that the Persian threat required his presence, perhaps pressured by Belshazzar or other members of the court, perhaps moved by considerations we cannot recover. But his return did not repair the damage of his decade-long absence. The political relationships were calcified, the priestly opposition was entrenched, and the trust between the king and the institutions of the state, the temple, the military, the provincial administration, was broken beyond what a mere return could restore. Nabonidus's efforts to consolidate the city's defenses included a move that may have been strategically rational, but was politically catastrophic. He ordered the cult statues of various gods to be gathered from outlying cities and brought into Babylon for safekeeping. From a purely military standpoint, this made a certain kind of sense, concentrating sacred objects behind the strongest fortifications, denying the enemy symbolic prizes that could be used as leverage or propaganda. From a theological and political standpoint, it was a disaster. The cities whose gods had been taken, whose divine protectors had been stripped from their temples, whose cosmic security had been violated by the king's own order, were outraged and terrified. Rather than rallying the empire to Babylon's defense, Nabonidus had given every provincial city a personal grievance and Cyrus a ready-made propaganda gift. The Cyrus cylinder specifically promises to return these gods to their home cities. I returned the images of the gods who had resided there to their places, and I let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned them to their dwellings. And this promise, which Cyrus appears to have kept, purchased the gratitude and loyalty of provincial populations across the empire more effectively than any military victory could have. The decisive military engagement took place not at Babylon itself, but at Opis, a city on the Tigris River to the north of Babylon, in late September or early October of 539 BC. The details of the battle are frustratingly sparse. The Nabonidus Chronicle, the primary cuneiform source, records that the army of Cyrus entered Opis without battle in one passage, but then refers to a conflict and an apparent massacre in another, creating a textual ambiguity that scholars have debated for over a century. What seems clear is that a significant Babylonian force was defeated at or near Opis, that the defeat was decisive, and that it was followed by some form of violent aftermath, whether a massacre of soldiers, a sacking of the city, or reprisals against the population is unclear. But the Nabonidus Chronicle's reference to the people of Akkad revolting and the dead bodies suggests that the fall of Opis was not the bloodless walkover that the fall of Babylon itself would prove to be. After Opis, the important religious center of Sippar, a city sacred to the sun god Shamash, located between Opis and Babylon, surrendered without a fight, its population and priesthood apparently unwilling to resist the advancing Persians. Nabonidus, who may have been at Sippar when it fell, fled. The chronicle records his flight without specifying his destination, though he would eventually be captured. And then came Babylon. The Nabonidus Chronicle records the event with a bureaucratic terseness that is almost comical given the enormity of what it describes. On the 16th day, Ugbaru, the governor of Gutium, and the army of Cyrus entered Babylon without battle. Without battle. Ugbaru, a figure whose precise identity and background are debated, though he appears to have been a Babylonian or Gutian governor who had gone over to the Persian side, led the advance force into the city, and the city received them without significant resistance. Green twigs were spread in front of him, the chronicle records, a gesture of welcome, of submission, of relief. The gates opened. The greatest fortified city in the ancient world, protected by walls that Herodotus claimed were 80 feet thick and over 300 feet high, exaggerations. Well, certainly, but the real walls were still enormously impressive, surrounded by moats, supplied by the Euphrates flowing through its center, containing enough stored grain to withstand years of siege. Let the enemy walk in. Cyrus himself entered the city on October 29th, roughly 2 weeks after the military occupation had begun, in what was clearly a carefully staged ceremonial entry designed to maximize the political impact. Not a conqueror arriving at the head of a war column, but a liberator received by a grateful populace, entering the city in peace and declaring peace to all of Babylon, according to the cylinder. The Hebrew Bible's book of Daniel tells a different story of that night. Belshazzar, feasting with 1,000 of his lords, but drinking wine from the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the temple in Jerusalem, when a mysterious hand appears and writes on the plaster of the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Daniel, the Jewish exile, is summoned to interpret, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And that very night, the text says, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain. The story is almost certainly not historical in its details. Daniel is a work of religious literature, not a chronicle, and its purpose is theological rather than historiographical. But the image it creates has proven more powerful than any cuneiform tablet. the writing on the wall, the feast of the doomed. The kingdom weighed and found wanting. It is one of those images that escapes its original context and becomes a permanent metaphor, available to anyone in any century who needs a way to describe the moment when a power that thought itself invulnerable discovers, too late, that the judgment has already been rendered and the sentence is already being carried out. The aftermath of the fall reveals as much about why Babylon fell as the event itself, because what Cyrus did after entering the city was, in many respects, more remarkable and more historically consequential than how he entered it. He did not sack the city. He did not raze the temples. He did not massacre the population, enslave the elite, or impose the kind of collective punishment that had characterized Assyrian imperial practice and that most ancient conquerors considered standard operating procedure. Instead, he enacted the narrative he had constructed: liberation, restoration, the return of proper order. He restored the Akitu festival, reinstating the relationship between Marduk and the Babylonian kingship. He returned the displaced cult statues to their home cities across the former empire. He maintained the Babylonian administrative apparatus largely intact, governing through existing institutions, existing officials, existing procedures. The scribes kept writing cuneiform, the temples kept functioning, the tax system kept operating, the calendar kept marking the months and the years. What changed was the name at the top: Cyrus, king of Babylon, a king of the lands, and the source of ultimate authority, which now ran to Persepolis and Ecbatana rather than to the ziggurat of Etemenanki. But at the level of the temple, the marketplace, the canal, the field, life continued with a degree of continuity that is genuinely remarkable given the scale of the political transformation. And then there were the exiles. Among the many populations displaced by Nebuchadnezzar's conquests were the Jews, the elite of the kingdom of Judah, deported to Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 586 BC, living in exile communities that had maintained their religious identity and their hope of return across nearly half a century of displacement. Cyrus issued a decree, recorded in the Hebrew Bible's Book of Ezra, and corroborated, at least in its general outlines, by the broader policy described in the Cyrus Cylinder, permitting the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. This act, which from Cyrus's perspective was one administrative decision among many, part of a general policy of religious restoration and population return designed to generate loyalty across the empire, but earned him an extraordinary distinction in Jewish tradition. The prophet Isaiah, or more precisely, the anonymous exilic prophet whose words are collected in the latter chapters of the book of Isaiah, sometimes called Deutero-Isaiah, called Cyrus God's anointed, Mashiach, Messiah. A pagan king, a Persian, a worshipper of gods that Jewish theology did not even acknowledge as real, called the Lord's anointed, chosen by the God of Israel to end the exile and restore the holy city. This is, in the context of ancient Israelite theology, an almost inconceivable claim, and it tells you something about the magnitude of the event as experienced by the Jewish community. But it also tells you something about Cyrus's genius, or perhaps about the genius of the universe's timing, that the same act of imperial policy simultaneously served Persian strategic interests and generated the kind of theological loyalty that no amount of military force could have purchased. The Cyrus Cylinder itself has had an afterlife that constitutes its own remarkable chapter in the history of political ideas. Discovered by the Assyriologist Hormuzd-Rassam during excavations at Babylon in 1879 and now housed in the British Museum, the cylinder was adopted in the 20th century by the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as a symbol of ancient Iranian civilization and, more tendentiously, as a proto-declaration of human rights. When the Shah's reading was historically questionable, the cylinder is a conventional piece of ancient Near Eastern royal propaganda, closely modeled on Babylonian literary forms, designed to legitimate a specific conquest, not to articulate universal principles, but it was politically effective, and the idea proved remarkably durable. The United Nations at one point displayed a replica, treating the cylinder as a precursor to modern human rights declarations. Most serious Assyriologists regard this characterization with diplomatic skepticism, pointing out that the cylinder says nothing about individual rights, nothing about limits on royal power, nothing about equality before the law, and that its tolerance is purely strategic, a technique for managing a diverse empire, not an expression of principled pluralism. All of this is true. But the fact that the document can be read with sufficient historical distance and interpretive generosity as something more than what it literally is, that a conqueror's self-serving proclamation can look 25 centuries later like a statement of tolerance and religious freedom, is itself evidence of the extraordinary political intelligence behind its composition. Cyrus, or the scribes who wrote for him, crafted propaganda so effective that it is still working. It is still being debated, still being claimed, still being argued over by people who would not recognize a cuneiform sign if they saw one. There are very few documents in human history about which the same can be said. The deeper question, the one that persists after you have accounted for the military campaign, the priestly alienation, the theological crisis, what the Persian strategy, the internal defections, is whether the fall of Babylon was, in some structural sense, inevitable, or whether it was the contingent product of specific personalities colliding in a specific moment. The case for structural inevitability is not weak. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was, from its inception, a one-dynasty project, more precisely, a one-reign project, because even within the founding dynasty, only Nebuchadnezzar possessed the combination of military ability, administrative competence, and monumental vision that made the empire function. His predecessors had been competent, his father Nabopolassar had been genuinely talented. But Nebuchadnezzar was the empire in a way that left the empire lethally dependent on his personal qualities. When those qualities were removed by death, what remained was a court, a collection of factions, rivalries, and ambitions held in check by nothing more robust than the deceased king's memory and the inertia of functioning institutions. The rapid succession of coups and assassinations between 562 and 556 demonstrated that the elite had never developed norms for transferring power peacefully, never built mechanisms for legitimate succession that could survive a contested transition, never created institutions that could substitute for the personality of the ruler. In this reading, Nabonidus's eccentricities were not the cause of the fall, but merely the specific contingent form taken by a vulnerability that was structural, the vulnerability of any political system that depends on the quality of its leader, because it has no other source of stability. Or had Nabonidus been a conventional, pious, Marduk-respecting king who stayed in his capital and performed the Akidu, the structural vulnerability would still have been there, waiting for the next crisis, a military defeat, a succession dispute, an economic downturn, to expose it. The case for contingency pushes back forcefully. Had Nabonidus not alienated the Marduk priesthood, had he performed the Akitu, maintained the temples, kept the religious establishment on his side, the priesthood would not have been available as a fifth column for Persian infiltration. Had he not left Babylon for a decade, the political relationships that held the empire together would not have atrophied to the point of collapse. Had he not gathered the provincial gods into Babylon, the provinces would not have had a specific, a personal grievance that Cyrus could exploit with his promise of restoration. The walls of Babylon were genuine fortifications, massive, well-maintained, capable of withstanding prolonged siege if the population inside was motivated to hold them. The agricultural resources of southern Mesopotamia were enormous, the granaries were full, and the Euphrates provided a water supply that could not easily be cut off. Herodotus's river diversion story, if it has any historical basis at all, may describe a partial lowering of the water level sufficient to allow passage under the river walls, not a dramatic draining of the entire riverbed. A determined, unified defense could have held the city for months, possibly years, and the Persian army, operating far from its bases across extended supply lines, might not have been able to sustain a prolonged siege. What Nabonidus destroyed was not Babylon's capacity to resist, but Babylon's will to resist. And that destruction was the product of specific decisions by a specific person. Decisions that were not foreordained by any structural logic, that a different king might not have made, that even Nabonidus himself might not have made, had his personal religious convictions or his political circumstances been slightly different. The honest position is that both readings are necessary and neither is sufficient. The structural weakness was real. The institutional shallowness, the succession problem, the one-reign dependency. And it meant that the Neo-Babylonian Empire was always more fragile than it appeared, always one bad ruler away from crisis. But structural weakness creates probabilities, not certainties. Plenty of structurally fragile polities survive for centuries through luck, geographic advantage, the absence of competent external threats, or the mere inertia of functioning systems. What made Babylon's fall both swift and total was the precise, unrepeatable conjunction of internal dissolution and external genius. A ruler who had systematically undermined every pillar of his own legitimacy, meeting an opponent who understood with preternatural clarity is exactly how to exploit each point of weakness. Cyrus did not merely overpower Babylon, he out-narrated it. He offered the Babylonian establishment a story about their own civilization, a story of restoration, of divine favor, of cosmic correction that was more persuasive than the story their own king was telling. And he backed that story with enough military force to make the choice between stories consequential. That combination, narrative superiority backed by military credibility, is the mechanism of the fall, and it's a mechanism that has appeared in various forms in virtually every legitimacy collapse in recorded history. The walls are never the point. The question is always whether the people inside believe the walls are worth defending. And Nabonidus, through a decade of absence and alienation, had answered that question before Cyrus ever had to ask it. There is a version of this story, the version told by the Hebrew prophets, by the book of Daniel, by the long Christian and Jewish tradition of interpreting Babylon as a symbol of worldly hubris and divine retribution, in which the fall is a moral parable. Babylon the Great is fallen, the book of Revelation would later declare, borrowing and amplifying the prophetic tradition, transforming the historical city into a metaphor for every corrupt, idolatrous, and doomed system of worldly power. In this reading, Babylon falls because it must, because God has decreed it, because the arrogance of the city demands its own destruction, because the writing on the wall is the handwriting of the divine. This interpretation has proven extraordinarily durable, so durable that the word Babylon itself has become, in English and in many other languages, a permanent metaphor for decadent, illegitimate, doomed power used by the authors of Revelation, by medieval preachers, by Protestant reformers describing the Catholic Church, by Rastafarian musicians describing Western imperialism, by anyone in any century who needs a single word to convey the idea of a magnificent system that is rotten at the core and destined for divine judgment. Whether this theological reading illuminates or obscures the historical reality depends entirely on what you think history is for and what you think the universe is like. But it is worth noting, worth pausing over, that the moral the prophets drew from the event is not, when stripped of its theological clothing, a bad piece of political analysis. They said that Babylon fell because its rulers had lost their way, had forgotten the obligations that legitimized their power, had placed their own interests above their duties to the gods and the people, had confused the possession of power with the right to power. Translated into secular language, this is more or less exactly what happened. The prophets got the mechanism right. They simply attributed the agency to a different actor. What remains, when the theological interpretations are set aside and the military narrative is exhausted and the cuneiform tablets have yielded everything they are going to yield, is an image, the image of a city that stood for centuries and fell in a day, not because its walls were breached, but because the idea the walls were built to protect had already been abandoned by the man who sat behind them. Babylon's walls were standing when Cyrus entered. They would continue to stand for centuries. Alexander the Great made Babylon one of his capitals, died in Nebuchadnezzar's palace in 323 BC, and the city remained inhabited well into the early centuries of the Common Era before slowly declining into the ruin and the legend it is today. The walls outlasted the empire by half a millennium. They were never the problem. The fall was in the space between the walls and the people they enclosed, in the evaporation of the belief that the thing inside the walls was worth defending, that the order the walls represented was real and functioning and aligned with the will of heaven. Every empire, every institution, and every political order rests ultimately not on its physical fortifications or its military capability, but on a story, a narrative about why this arrangement of power is legitimate, why these particular people have the right to rule, why the sacrifices demanded of the governed are justified by the order that the government provides. When the ruler stops telling that story, or tells it badly, or tells a different story that contradicts the old one, or simply walks away for 10 years and leaves the story untold, the walls become irrelevant. They are stone and brick and bitumen. What held, what always holds, is the story, the shared belief, the compact between power and meaning. And when the compact breaks, the walls are just architecture. Cyrus did not have to tear them down. He just had to offer a better story to the people standing behind them, and standing outside the gates of the greatest city on earth, promising to restore what its own king had desecrated, he did exactly that. The gates opened, and the oldest living empire in the world walked through them in the other direction, out of history and into myth, leaving behind nothing but a name that would echo for millennia as a warning and a wonder, as a metaphor for every power that believed its walls would hold forever, and as a question that every civilization, sooner or later, standing behind its own walls and looking at its own king, has to answer for itself.